Hello, human geographers. We are back at it for our next lecture in unit number 7 on cities and urban land use. Tonight we're going to be talking about a lot of different topics as they relate to urbanization and the changing dynamics in cities and things like that. So we're going to be jumping around quite a bit tonight. So let's go ahead and jump on in, get started. First thing that we have to talk about, and this is review at this point, is basic and non-basic industries and their relationship to cities. So we start out with basic industries, which again are industries that sell their products or services primarily to consumers outside of the settlement. Okay, for example, steel in Pittsburgh, automobiles in Detroit, technology in Silicon Valley. For Las Vegas, we're mainly talking about tourism, entertainment, that kind of thing is our basic industry. And we typically characterize these industries as city-forming industries. So they're the ones upon which cities are formed and really kind of get their name. When you think of automobiles, you tend to think of Detroit because that's what the city was built upon. Even if it's not necessarily the most representative example anymore. And so that's going to be important. Now, on the flip side, non-basic industries are city-serving industries. They serve the communities with which they're in. And again, definition, industries that sell their products primarily to consumers in the community. So, you're talking about your banks, your grocery stores, construction, barber shops, gas stations, those types of things. All right, they're mainly there to serve the city. They're not the basis of the city. They don't form the city, but they serve the city. Every city has these non-basic industries. And that's going to be important here in just a moment. Because cities that are founded on basic industries don't always remain that way forever. For example, manufacturing towns like Pittsburgh, and again we said Pittsburgh's basic industry was steel, it doesn't always remain that way. Sometimes these cities go through that process of deindustrialization, where those industrial jobs move elsewhere, especially in this more globalized world in which we're in. They might move to newly industrialized countries, things like that. And so there is this period of unemployment, and Pittsburgh has gone through this. A lot of the steel manufacturing isn't taking place in Pittsburgh anymore, and so they've gone through that period of high unemployment as they switch to tertiary sector activities. And now there's a lot of automation that takes place in Pittsburgh, and so there's been kind of an interesting shift that's taken place there. University towns that started with a university or were centered on a university might be more diverse. And so they might not have just that university anymore. Now they might start to attract businesses that are related to this. Great example of agglomeration out in the West Coast. A lot of times those high-tech industries chose those West Coast universities, as well as, the Research Triangle in North Carolina, go up into Boston, MIT, Harvard. They chose those areas because they had a really strong university program. So while the city might have started out as a university town, it doesn't always remain that way. Mining towns, for example, in Nevada, Virginia City. It started out as a mining town, it was a boom town, and now it's mainly tourism. It's a tourist attraction. So it started out in the primary sector extracting raw materials, and now it's shifted to something else because things change over time. Cities diversify over time, and they start to reach out into other sectors of the economy so that, if there is a dip in their basic industry, it doesn't destroy the economy of those local areas. But it also can go through, examples we mentioned, deindustrialization in the Rust Belt. Pittsburgh being a great example, Detroit being a great example. So there are those elements of that. And as those cities diversify and change, we're starting to see the employment composition change as well for a number of different reasons. One being immigration. Ravenstein's laws of migration tell us that most migration is from rural to urban. So people keep moving to these cities. And especially in these industrial towns, these cities that were centered on industry, they grew very, very rapidly and needed a lot of workers. Well, as they deindustrialized, that has had a big impact, and so people have moved elsewhere as a result. In addition to that, we've also seen an increase in the number of dual income households. In the early 1900s, there were very few dual income households, and many women that were in the workplace were not working in jobs that paid them nearly as much as the men in the household. However, after World War II and during World War II, men went off to fight in the war, and who filled those factory jobs? Women did. And when men came back from the war, women were in the workplace and they were making good money. And so we saw a dynamic shift in the number of dual income households. And so over time, that has made a huge change. Now, once again, urban planners have to take into consideration a lot of different things, like aesthetics, we just covered that, but also transportation systems. So let's shift gears to that right now. Okay? A lot of urban growth is attributed to rural to urban migration. We mentioned Ravenstein earlier today because Ravenstein said that most migration is from rural to urban. Now, we still see that very much in LDCs. A lot of people still moving from the countryside into urban areas. However, in more developed countries, most of the areas are urbanized. The vast majority of the population lives in urban areas. So that migration from the countryside to the city isn't so much a factor anymore. And so what we tend to see more in MDCs is suburbanization. But again, that's going to be a bit more in Anglo-America. And we touched on that with our models of urban land use, that suburbanization is really more of an Anglo-American trend. Now, a lot of times, especially historically, why did people move from the countryside to the cities? Well, one, there were more economic opportunities, especially as cities industrialized. There were more jobs. This concept that they might be able to make a better life for their family. And so what we end up seeing is, especially in LDCs, squatter settlements. Now that'll be our next lecture when we talk about low-income areas of the city, because there's such a huge movement to the city that a lot of times cities can't sustain that. So one job of the urban planner is to come up with and plan for different modes of transportation. It's really, really fascinating, especially in North America, to take a look at cities that predated automobiles to cities that were largely built after the automobile was invented. For example, you look at New York, and New York predates automobiles, and so the city structure is a little bit different, versus Henderson, Nevada, which was built after the invention of automobiles. And we see a different way in which the city is laid out. But there are more modes of transportation that have to be considered. Public transportation like buses, trains, whether those are commuter trains, whether those are subways, whether those are light rail. There's a lot of different things that have to be taken into consideration as we move forward. The topic of conversation is probably going to shift more towards high-speed rail, linking urban areas that are more distant and typically less connected, or have been in the past connected by highways. And so urban planners have to account for that. And one big element that influenced urban planners, especially in the United States, was the Interstate Highway system, which is one of our vocabulary terms, so here is the definition. The Interstate Highway system was begun in the 1950s and funded largely by the federal or U.S. government. It created large, limited access superhighways, connected cities, and made it easier for people to live farther away from cities. So what ended up happening is rapid suburbanization. Now we're going to get to that here in just a moment. So taking a look at this, this looks at the interstate highway system here in the United States. And we have one major interstate highway that is connecting Las Vegas, and that is Interstate 15. Now, there's actually a system. It's hard to discern from this picture, but there's actually a grid-like system that works here. Interstate highways that run north and south are odd numbers. Interstate 15, for example. But interstates that run east and west have even numbers. Interstate 10, Interstate 40, for example. Now, one upcoming event for us here in the city of Henderson and in Las Vegas is that we will be getting a new interstate relatively soon. Right now we only have Interstate 15, which kind of links us to Los Angeles and then on to Salt Lake City. The two largest cities in the country that are not directly linked by an interstate right now are Las Vegas and Phoenix. But that will be changing in the near future when we get Interstate 11, which is going to run from roughly like Phoenix through Las Vegas on to Reno. And so that's the rough plan. I'm sure it extends further than that, but for us and the local impact of it, that's the big part. And so it's really interesting to see. And this is something that still continues to matter nowadays. Now, we have a new model that we have to introduce, and that is Borkert's model. Now, Borkert's model is a model of interstate or international travel, and essentially looks at different modes of transportation at different periods of time in history. And so he calls them epochs. They're just periods of time. So we start out with the sail wagon epoch, 1790 to 1830. This is using periods of time for the United States. And cities were relatively isolated, very limited connections. Most people never really left the city in which they were born and definitely didn't travel very far because the only modes of transportation were, well, boats or wagons. And so it took a lot longer to get from place to place. As we move forward, as the United States begins to industrialize, and a great connection to this would be, connecting these with, stages of Rostoy's model. Where are the connections here? Is the Iron Horse epoch, 1830 to 1870. And what do you think that Iron Horse is referring to? Because we're not referring to literal horses. We're talking about an iron horse. And so we're talking about steam-powered railroads. And so this is the early period of time when railroads are just beginning to emerge. We haven't seen the fruition of all this investment that's going to come in. That comes in a later epoch. But for the first time, regions start to be connected. People can get further faster. So this is an element of space-time compression. Move forward into the steel rail epoch. Again, this is still trains. We're still talking about railroads, 1870 to 1920. And this is when the country is connected, the transcontinental railroad. And we're seeing greater interdependence amongst regions. Different regions are dependent on one another because they could be. Goods could get from Chicago to New York relatively quickly. Goods could get across the country in a time that was manageable, not months, but maybe days. And so we start to see that change. The final stage that is actually part of Borkert's model is the auto air amenity epoch, 1920 to 1970, which is when the formal model ends. And this would be like Rostoy's age of mass consumption. And we see now people have the money in order to buy their own car. All right? And we're going to talk about that again with suburbanization here in a couple minutes. We're seeing the use of airplanes that is starting to become more affordable, but it's still an amenity. It's still a luxury. The final stage that I have on here is since 1970, and that's the satellite electronic jet propulsion epoch, that more and more people are able to afford mass transit on a global scale. And it's not a formal stage of Borkert's model, but the reality is things have changed quite a bit since 1970. And so we have to recognize that. We have to recognize that now in the 21st century, we're talking about, just average, ordinary people going into space. We're talking about space tourism now. So things have changed quite a bit. And that is worth mentioning. Now, I love this graphic because it shows the changes in periods of time, how far people would be able to get from New York City, so it's centered on New York City, in 1800 versus 1830. So during the sail wagon epoch versus the iron horse epoch. And what it is, well, it's an isoline map, so hopefully we caught that. But on the left-hand side, you can see how far people are able to get in 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 day, 5 days, 6 days, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. And that changes within one person's lifetime, that people are able to get further faster. And this is a great example of space-time compression. It's a really neat graphic to look at. Now, the next model that we're going to look at, Borkert's model was about interstate, international travel. This is looking at travel within a state, within a city. So this is Adams' model. Adams' model looks at intrastate, intracity travel, starting with the walking horse cart era, 1790 to 1888. And at this period of time, cities that were built around this time, people got around by using horse carts, horse-drawn carriages, things like that. So the streets were very narrow. Cities that were built after this, during the electric streetcar era, during the recreational auto era, which is when the city of Henderson comes into existence, that changes things and changes the way that cities are laid out. It changed the way that people get around. And so the next one, 1888 to 1920, was the electric streetcar era, an era of mass transit. At this period of time, people are living in the city center. They're able to walk to a lot of places, and if they need to get someplace a little bit further, they're using public transit, mass transit. We don't see a lot of people using their own individual cars. That comes next, the recreational auto era. This is for people who could afford their own automobile. And so we're talking about the wealthy, high socioeconomic status. Everyone else still used public transportation. They still use mass transit. So we don't see a change in the cities quite yet. Henderson comes into existence towards the end of this period of time, towards the end of the recreational auto era, and more, and especially it has grown, during the freeway era. And this is the era of commuter travel. And this is when we see the expansion of suburbs. So let's explain how that works. So the first thing that we have to do is identify what suburbanization is. Now, we've talked about it throughout the year. We've defined it going back to our migration unit, but this is how it affects us when we're talking about the development of cities. Suburbanization is the movement of upper and middle class people from urban core areas to their surrounding outskirts to escape pollution as well as deteriorating social conditions, whether those are perceived or actual. In North America, the process became a mass phenomenon by the second half of the 20th century due to decentralization of cities and automobile dependency. So, that second half of that definition is vitally important because suburbanization really is more of a North American phenomenon. In other parts of the world, as we saw with the international models of cities, most of the people who can't afford to live in the city center live out in the suburbs. The suburbs aren't the desirable place to move. Instead, it is the city center. So in North America, people are desiring to move out to the suburbs. So what are suburbs? A subsidiary urban area surrounding and connected to the central city. Many are exclusively residential. Others have their own commercial centers or shopping malls. Especially now, we're starting to see more of not just residential. There's also going to be commercial centers and shopping malls. And we see a rise in this following World War II. After World War II, again, we mentioned the shift to dual income households. Women are working now and bringing home much greater incomes than they have in the past. Men are working, so we have dual income households. In addition to that, factories are churning out cars, are a great example. And when you mass produce something, you're driving that price down. As cars become more affordable to more people, and you're making more money, and soldiers coming back with things like the GI Bill are able to go to college and make even more money. We see mass production of houses on the outskirts of cities because that's where there was the space. Now what we're seeing is the explanation for this, how these suburbs grew so rapidly. And now 95% of transportation within the United States by personal automobile. And part of that is because of mass production of goods. Part of that is because of dual income households. Part of that is improving educational systems. Part of that is the interstate highway system. All of these different elements contributed to the development of suburbs and the growth of suburbs and suburbanization. So, what has developed are what we call edge cities. An edge city is a key new concept of a modern city. They combine all the functions of a central business district but are located in the suburbs and provide more jobs than homes. So, an edge city is essentially a central business district and a smaller city on the edge of this urban area that might have started out with a single CBD decades ago. And then galactic cities kind of build on that. A mini edge city that's connected to another city by beltways or highways. Great example of what we see here in the Las Vegas Valley is how connected all of our suburban outskirts are. Henderson is connected to Mountain's Edge. Mountain's Edge connected to Summerlin. Summerlin connected to Aliante. Hey, so we have this great system of connections that we have here in the Las Vegas Valley. Now, edge cities kind of started out where residents would live but then commute into the central city. But as these areas grew and as cities diversified, we started to see other industries develop. And so we started to see more shopping malls. We started to see light manufacturing and smaller manufacturing. We started to see really specialized industries like theme parks. We started to see airports in some of these smaller areas that might not have been in the past big enough to support an airport according to central place theory. And then those airports surrounded by other elements that are related to that, whether those are tourism with like hotels, whether it is shipping and warehousing, all elements that are part of this. Now, there's a couple different types of edge cities that we want to briefly mention so that we understand just what they are. Again, I would anticipate maybe a multiple choice question on this. So a couple different types of edge cities. Boomburgs are essentially cookie cutter suburban communities that have popped up recently. When we think about Henderson, especially when Henderson was growing very, very rapidly in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, a lot of those homes looked very, very similar. Okay? That they're just cookie cutter homes. They all look the same. But now, from an aesthetic standpoint, we've started to see homeowners associations and zoning laws that require that two houses that are right next to each other don't have the same paint job, that have different aesthetic features, whether those are, stonework on the front of the house, things like that. But if you go back just a couple decades and you look at, a neighborhood that popped up during that period of time, very, very similar. Then we also see greenfields incorporated as part of edge cities, these open areas that are preserved, but with the potential for future development. And then finally, uptowns, residential areas that are, quote, uptown from the central business district. Now, One thing that we have to mention as these suburban areas have continued to grow is this concept of urban sprawl. And Henderson was labeled as having some of the worst urban sprawl, I think actually the worst urban sprawl in the country for a couple of years during our rapid growth. And that's part of what we talked about with those boombergs, these cookie cutters. It's really efficient. It's really easy to crank out a bunch of homes, but you have to because it's growing so fast. And urban sprawl is the unrestricted growth in many American urban areas of housing, commercial development, and roads over large expanses of land with little concern for urban planning. And coming back and trying to rectify those any issues that might result later on. And again, this was very much an issue for Henderson moving forward. And it's since slowed down. Part of the reason is that migration to southern Nevada has slowed down. And it's very much in something that is of concern in North American cities if it does go unchecked, if issues do arise, if there isn't proper planning that is put forth. Now, there are some issues that result from urban sprawl, things like who makes decisions? Who's making these decisions? Are they municipalities? Are they the cities themselves? Townships as they're growing? What about unincorporated areas? We have several unincorporated areas of Clark County. So who makes the decision? Is it the county? Is it the closest municipality? Is it the city? School districts. Clark County School District is massive. It was the 5th largest school district in the country. Decision making can be kind of difficult for that. And then regional planning commissions. You have lots of different people coming together, whether they are municipalities, the county. You also are going to have school districts involved in that. And different people are going to have different opinions on this. So as a result, we've seen several things kind of pop up. One thing that's especially utilized in Europe are green belts. A ring of land maintained as parks, agriculture, other types of open space to limit the sprawl of an urban area. And this was in response especially to industrial cities. And then on the flip side of that, we've seen new models for cities like slow growth cities, where there are mixed land use, where you might have residential and commercial very, very close together. Mixed residential, where you might have single family detached houses next to apartment buildings. Very defined boundaries to try and limit sprawl, and more walkable communities, which gives way to, and now we have new urbanism, which is one of our vocabulary terms, and here's the definition. Outlined by a group of architects, urban planners, and developers from over 20 countries, an urban design that calls for development, urban revitalization, and suburban reforms that create walkable neighborhoods with a diversity of housing and jobs. Now, they've actually laid out all the characteristics that would apply to a new urbanist community. And a really good example is Celebration, Florida, which was actually originally created for cast members for Walt Disney World, but is very much built on the principles of new urbanism. Has to be walkable, so people can walk place to place. And if they can't walk, number 8 says that they have to have smart transportation, a lot of light rail, things like that. Mixed use and diversity in terms of zoning laws. So you're going to see, commercial right next to residential, very accessible. Mixed housing in terms of residential. So you're going to see single family homes, duplexes, apartments, different things like that, all in close proximity to one another. And so really what this is an attempt to try and rectify some of the issues of urban sprawl by trying to create an environment that is not entirely self-contained, but that people don't need cars to get around. They can walk most places. And I actually had a brother-in-law that lived down in Celebration, Florida. Different brother-in-law that lived in New York, but a brother-in-law that lived in Celebration, Florida, and very much so he could walk just about everywhere. About the only place that he needed to drive to was to work. Everything else in his daily life, grocery store, restaurants, barber, all this kind of stuff was within walking distance. And in fact, I think they actually had shuttle services for the Disney cast members so that they didn't even have to drive their own personal cars. But that is one response to the changes brought on by urban sprawl. So we're going to continue this in class. I'll see you guys next time. Have a good night.